Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. I'm Callie, and today I'm doing the Get to Know the Fantasy Reader tag that Bippity Boppity Books tagged us in. Sarah did hers last week, so you can check out her responses. So naturally, I really wanted to give my responses to this. So there are several questions for me to run through. I have a little pile of books for all the questions, so I'm gonna jump right into it. The first question is, what is your fantasy origin story? What kind of books got you into fantasy? I have been reading fantasy majority of my life. My dad is a really big fantasy reader, and when I was growing up, Harry Potter was a huge book at the time. He was buying the books as they were coming out, and they were my bedtime stories. So I grew up with Harry Potter. I fell in love with fantasy that way. I read Lord of the Rings and all of those kinds of books. I read Game of Thrones as the show was announced. And I loved reading fantasy worlds and transporting into different worlds, essentially. I read a lot as I was younger, but with high school and college, I stopped reading. I read a little bit here and there. I read Hunger Games, Divergent. Honestly, things that were getting made into films. I wanted to jump onto the books before they came out as movies so that I could have the backstory. And I don't know, I've always liked doing that. I still do it to this day. If there's a movie coming out and I haven't read the book, I will make sure to read the book before the film comes out. Or if the movie's been out and I didn't know, I will go and read the book. It's just, I always read the book before I see the movie. But after college and just kind of reading on and off, I wanted a new hobby, and I always got back into reading. So the big series that got me back into fantasy after college is the Red Queen series by Victoria Aveyard. I fell in love with this immediately, devoured it. I ended up finding this because my sister was reading this series and she wanted me to take her to Barnes & Noble to buy the newest book. And then she let me borrow her copy and we kind of read it together. She dropped off on reading it because at that point reading was no longer cool, so she stopped reading. And I continued on in the series, and then I was perusing the bookstore and I found Three Dark Crowns, which was a brand new release. I picked that up and I have not stopped picking up fantasy books since. But definitely getting me back into the reading and everything, I would give to The Red Queen by Victoria Aveyard and Kendar Blake for Three Dark Crowns. The second question is, if you could be a hero, who would be the author and what tropes would you insist on? For who I would want to be the author, I picked Lynette Noni, because I have recently become obsessed with her stories and her writing style. I love the way that she writes her characters. I think she makes them extremely multidimensional and she makes them realistic. As for tropes, I am a huge romantic, so I definitely want some sort of romantic plotline as I am heroing, because I love a good romantic story. I'm not a big fan of the love triangle trope, but like one bed, forced proximity, any of those I am game for. But one of the things I do love in fantasies is a romantic subplot. I have read some what I would consider romantic fantasies where the romance is the plot and then the fantasy element is the subplot. Those I do enjoy, but I prefer there to be the fantastical element and then the romantic subplot. But Lynette Noni does that really, really well. I love the little Easter eggs that she places and the twists and turns and the way that she just builds up her characters, their dialogue. Everyone feels so tangible, and I adore that about her writing. Number 3 is, what fantasy book have I read this year that I want everyone else to read? My brain immediately went to The Ivory Key by Acacia Ramon. This is a debut, and I cannot stop thinking about it. I read this all the way back in January or February this year, and I still think about this book. It is so immersive. It is filled with Middle Eastern folklore, amazing sibling dynamics, and just, it is so good. It has all the things that I crave out of fantasy. Great banter, great magical elements, some weird thing about the magical elements that's happening, and really well-written characters. For me, if a character is poorly written or a character sucks, I can't get over that. I am a very character-driven reader, and if the plot's amazing but the characters fall flat, I will DNF a book. And I have done it, which is unfortunate, but I am so character driven, and this book does that so well. The fourth question is, what is your favorite fantasy subgenre, and what is one that you haven't read much from? So I guess favorite subgenre, I'd have to say high fantasy. I love the different creatures, the fae, the wolves, the shapeshifters, as well as elemental magic, and that's all high fantasy. And I love getting into politics of different races. Humans versus fae is a huge one that I adore. I also really like sci-fi. I've been slowly getting into sci-fi the last year or so, and I really like it. Some of my favorites are like the J. Kristoff, Amy Kaufman trilogies. I really adore. I've been reading Skyward by Brandon Sanderson, so I really like sci-fi. I like Star Wars. I've never been like a huge Star Wars person, or Star Trek. I liked them, so I was never super drawn to the sci-fi genre piece of fantasy until I started reading these books. And now I adore the futuristic elements that because you can go so creative, and these authors that I've found get really, really creative with the technology, with the extraterrestrial aliens and all of this. I just get a big kick out of it. So that one's a current favorite. One that I don't read that often is magical realism, which, funny enough, technically Harry Potter counts as magical realism because it's within our world, but little magic pieces exist within our world. And I do love Harry Potter, but I don't know, I'm just not drawn to magical realism. I understand what it draws with other people, but to me, like the backs of those books, they sound so boring to me. And I haven't really found any magical realism book that speaks to me on the same levels that Harry Potter did. So it's not that I don't dislike the genre, I just haven't found anything alluring to me within that subgenre. The fifth question is, who is one of my auto-buy authors? I have so many auto-buy authors, it's kind of ridiculous, but the one that always comes to mind when I hear auto-buy author is Trisha Levenseller. I will buy anything this woman writes. I will buy her grocery list. She is such a master of weaving these very well done, fully fleshed out stories in a short amount of time. This is a standalone, and I love this book. And I love a good series. This could have been a full series, and it still would have been great, but it works really well as a standalone, and I attribute that to Trisha Levenseller's writing style. She is a fast-paced writer, and her characters are, again, dynamic, really fun. I care about them almost immediately. She is so good at getting that hook right away, and it doesn't help the fact that I've met her. She was the first author I met and went to a signing for, and she was the sweetest person. We went to her event for Warrior of the Wild, which came out a year before this book, and she read us the first chapter of this book. And you have no idea how hard it was to sit there and wait a year and a half for this book to drop after just hearing that first chapter. She has that hook, and I've adored every single book that she's written. Number 6 is, how do I typically find fantasy recommendations? The obvious ones are obviously TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram. I am on all 3 of those platforms, so naturally when I see content creators who have very similar tastes to me and they are raving about a fantasy book, I will read about it and then determine if it's something that I am also interested in. I try and follow people who have similar tastes as me and go based off of their recommendations, but I also just peruse the bookstore. I read the backs of books. I take a look at just what speaks to me on that specific day. I'm also very active on Goodreads. I look through all their lists and I do a lot of stuff like that. I look for blurbs from authors that I know I adore. Covers. I am very drawn to a pretty cover. Those are just kind of a few of the ways that I find different book recommendations. I'm just all over the place. Also, if I do get to chatting with people in the bookstores. It just happens. Sarah and I are very social at the bookstore. We make lots of friends. They'll give me recommendations, so I'll go on with those. I get them from all over. Next question is upcoming fantasy that I'm excited for. This is not a small list, but I limited myself to 3. The first one being Defend the Dawn by Bridget Kemmer. This is the second book in her Defy the Night series, and I read that right when it came out. We went to her event here in the area last year for her book, this book tour, and we had a lot of fun. I loved meeting Bridget Kemmer, met her for the second time at a Polycon. So I'm really excited to get to Defend the Dawn, especially with how Defy the Night ended. Another sequel that I have is The Dragon's Promise by Elizabeth Kim. The Dragon's Promise is the sequel to Six Crimson Cranes, which was one of my favorite books of last year. It was full of whimsy and felt like a Studio Ghibli movie, and I'm hoping and I know that she'll be able to pull that through to the second one. She did it with Spin the Dawn, and I have extremely high expectations for this one as well. Now, the one that I have that is not a sequel is The Luminaries by Susan Dennard. I really like Susan Dennard. She is the author of the Truth Witch saga, I think is what it's officially called. That one's not done, but this is her new book, which actually I learned was based off of a Twitter voting thread where she would put different scenarios and the readers on Twitter would vote for different pathways. It was like a choose your own adventure, and she took that and made it into an actual novel, and everything about that sounds amazing. Sarah actually just got an arc of this book and is reading it right now, and I am uber jealous because this sounds like it would be so chaotic and so much fun. The next question is, what is one misconception about fantasy you want to lay to rest? I don't really know. I am all over with fantasy. I mean, really the biggest one that's been going on is that fantasy is also fairy smut, which there are some that are, but those I would classify more as the romantic fantasy opposed to fantasy romance. And just, you gotta know what you're looking at. As much as I do like going blindly into a book, I at least have somewhat of knowledge of what I'm getting myself into. But I know that like smut talk, romance, all the romance stuff is getting a lot more traction as of recently because of book talk. So fantasy can just be fantasy. There doesn't need to be a romance. There doesn't need to be smut or anything like that in it. It doesn't make it better or worse. Sometimes it does make it better. Sometimes it makes it infinitely worse. It depends. Like I said, I do like a good romance in my fantasy, but it depends on the book. Sometimes the romance feels forced. Sometimes the romance isn't necessary. Sometimes they choose the wrong guy. Or girl. I get upset. But it is what it is, and I don't know. That's kind of the only misconception I can really think of when it comes to fantasy novels. The next question is, if someone you know doesn't read a lot of fantasy asks for a recommendation, what are the first 3 books that come to mind? I actually get this question a fair amount, and I have bullied several friends and coworkers into reading some of my favorite books. So I do ask a lot of follow-ups. I am known as the reader and everything among friends and family, as well as at my job. So when someone does ask me for recommendations, I ask a lot of follow-up questions just to kind of get a gauge. The first one, again, is how much romance do you like? If you like a lot of romance, let me steer you this way. Do you like more politically based politically based fantasies? So I have a couple of like definitely ready options. One of my favorite fantasies that I always try and recommend is The Kiss of Deception by Mary E. Pearson. This does lean more heavily towards the romance, but I think that this is a fantastic fantasy story with a lot of the war and battle and economic strife within the story itself. For more heavily political drama within a fantasy world that's easy to consume, I usually go towards The Cruel Prince by Holly Black. It's a fantastic story, very fast-paced, very fun, but heavily political and very dark. She likes to go with the fairy that is described in like original fairy tales where they're tricksters and try and get you technically what you want, but at a cost that you're not really prepared for. And of course, my go-to recommendation is usually something Sarah J. Maas, Throne of Glass, ACOTAR. I usually avoid recommending Crescent City immediately. Once they've read the other two series, then I'll recommend them to continue on to Crescent City. But these are just such good fantasy stories. And Throne of Glass is definitely way more on the political side than the romance side, especially in the very beginning. We don't, even throughout the entire story, yes, there is a big romance plot line, but it is not the whole story. There's so much more to Throne of Glass than the romance. Whereas ACOTAR, yes, it leans way more into the romance than it does the plot line, which is fine if that's what you're looking for. But high stakes, high adventure, high battle, high darkness, Throne of Glass is the way to go for fantasy. The last question is, who is the most recent fantasy reading content creator that I want to shout out? So I'm really bad with remembering names. I've been doing a lot of TikTok. Not that I don't post. I creep on TikToks. Recently, I've been really into KB Reading. She does a lot of cosplays. I've also been into Luna Laurier. She is an author. I've just pre-ordered her book of Shadow and Moonlight, which I'm really excited about. I also met her briefly at a Polycon with her Astoria cosplay, as well as I'm a part of Rosebud's Realm, which is hosted by Rosebud over on TikTok as well. I found her because of her Sarah J. Maas content and her theory spirals, but she still does a lot of other fantasy recommendations. She's the reason I'm going to be reading Fortuna Sworn. She's the reason I started reading Guild and A Touch of Darkness. So I've gotten a lot of recommendations from her as well, and the entire Discord community, which is fantastic. I love being a part of a reader community within Discord. It's a lot of fun. And that's the entire tag. This was really fun to kind of work through and explore and go through my own history with fantasy. Recently, I've actually been on a bit of a fantasy hiatus. I've been reading a lot more romance, but that's because of a Polycon and just in that mindset of reading more romance. I'm going to be finishing the Poppy Wars this week, so hopefully that will jumpstart me back into fantasy. So I have a ton more fantasy on my TBR for the rest of this month, and we're only halfway through. So with that, that's going to be it for today's video. Please like, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We post videos every Tuesday, Thursday, with the occasional Sunday, and I'll see you guys in our next video. Bye!